ListenLayer is one of the most powerful ways that you can easily capture and store Google Click IDs. We're going to walk you through how easy this is. The first step is that we're going to get the Google Click ID from the URL. Then we're going to store the GCLID in the user's browser. And then when a critical action occurs, such as submitting a form or beginning a chat, we're going to push the Google Click ID back into the data layer from the browser storage, making it available to Google Tag Manager. Simultaneously, we can push the Google Click ID into hidden fields on a form submission, for example, so that we can collect the GCLID directly with our leads. Let's dive into this and walk through it in the interface. So here we are inside of our ListenLayer account. And the first step is to make sure that my website is set up correctly. I have my domain defined for the test WordPress site that we're going to be using in this example. In addition to that, if I go into my Google Tag Manager, you'll see that I have the main ListenLayer script already running on my website, loading on all pages, and my changes are published. You can get that script right here. I'm going to jump to my website. And if you open the console by right-clicking and going to inspect, and then reload the page, you should see an object load into the console, and it'll have this ID. You can see 35FF, and I can compare that to my ListenLayer account. And this will give me some diagnostic information about what domains my account's enabled for, what listeners have been turned on. So I'm going to first jump to listeners. And if you recall, our initial goal is to capture the Google Click ID from the user's URL as they enter our website. So I'm going to turn on the URL parameters listener. And I'm going to jump to features. And I'm going to immediately navigate to my activity features, which are the ones that are going to generate my data layer activity. You can see we have one here. And what this feature does is it will automatically get and parse all of your URL parameters across your website as users enter and interact with your site. So Google Click ID is a URL parameter, and we're going to use this feature to capture that. So after enabling this feature, I'm going to go ahead and publish. And then I'm going to immediately go to my website. I'll do a hard refresh, and we should see inside of my enabled listeners that URL parameters is now turned on. So my first step is I need to get some test data inside of ListenLayer so that I can work with the variable that I want to capture, and that would be Google Click ID. So I'm simply going to visit my website with Google Click ID in the URL parameters. I'm going to then go back to my console, and I'll be able to quickly see that the URL parameters listener has pushed some data into the data layer. And I can see that Google Click ID is now available. So once this Google Click ID, which has an example, this 1, 2, 3, 4, obviously Google's actual click IDs are much longer. Once that's available in the data layer, there's a lot of things that I can do with it. So jumping back into ListenLayer, I'm going to go to variable settings. I'm going to expand my parameters. Now, this table is a reflection of all the variables, the automatic variables that we have seen on your website in the data layer. We collect all the variables so that you can see those. Now, this test website's going to have a lot of, or test account's going to have a lot of different variables. You can see my Google Click ID appears here. Now, the only reason that Google Click ID appears here is because I've actually visited my website with a Google Click ID while having the URL parameters listener turned on and having this feature turned on. That allows the data layer activity to be generated. ListenLayer then sees the Google Click ID and it becomes available under my variable settings as something that I can utilize in the system. So if you don't have Google Click ID appearing here, it's because you need to make sure that the URL parameters listener is turned on, the features turned on, and you've actually visited the site to send some test data to ListenLayer. So now we're going to jump back to features, and we're going to enable a feature under customization storage called browser storage. What this is going to do is it's going to allow us to take any piece of information from the data layer and store it in the user's browser as a cookie or local storage or as session storage. You can see as soon as I enable that, we have a new screen down here called browser storage. And I'm able to write rules here with specific conditions that will say, if this exists or that happens, take a certain value and store it into a local storage key or a session storage key. But I need those keys to exist inside of ListenLayer first so that I can store the information. So in this case, I'm going to jump up to browser storage variables. And this is a global setting because as soon as you create a browser storage variable, it's kind of a global thing that you can use either within a specific listener or even across listeners so that you can kind of pass information from one piece of data layer activity to another or across the user session. And you can see we have this local storage key here called user click ID. Now, you can create a local storage key, a cookie, or session storage. It's as simple as just hitting a plus sign here. So if you have a brand new account, your screen here will be empty. And you would just create a variable called Google Click ID. And you might wonder, why would I choose cookies? Why would I choose local storage? Why would I choose session storage? Just as a brief overview, session storage is not going to persist for very long, only during the user's current session. So we're not going to choose that because we want this Google Click ID to stick around for a while. Local storage is a good option because we can still work with it in ListenLayer. It is a little bit limited in that it can't interact with another server automatically, for example. So it's kind of like a dumb storage bucket, but it will tend to last a long time. Browsers will not clear the local storage necessarily as quick as they might clear a cookie, for example. But one of the limitations is that if you use multiple subdomains, then the local storage key value is not necessarily going to be passed from one subdomain to another. So if you need to kind of pass this Google Click ID across multiple subdomains, you may want to utilize a cookie. In this case, I already have a storage key called user GCLID, and I've actually created one that's a cookie and one that's a local storage key. So I don't need to create a new one, but you can easily create one and you can save it. And you could do what we're going to do here, which is actually store it in both if you're unsure which one to use. So now that I have my two variables that I want to put, when a Google Click ID comes in on a URL parameter and is put into the data layer, I want to actually store it in these two elements. And this is a common mistake. People will think that they're collecting the Google Click ID because they wrote some script to grab it from the URL parameter. But the problem is you need that Google Click ID when a user actually completes a critical action, such as filling out a form. So the Click ID has to be stored in the browser before it's saved and captured so that it becomes persistent. In this case, we're just going to focus on the local storage key. Of course, if you're going to set up cookies also, you would write two different rules. But so I went into browser storage and I set up a new rule here, and I'm going to call this rule store the GCLID. And you can add a description if you'd like. And I'm going to set a condition. So these conditions are based on the data layer activity, and I'm going to select an automatic variable. So back in my data layer activity, you can see we have a section in the data layer called automatic values, and we have a section called custom values. Custom values is empty right now because I would need to write rules to push custom values into my data layer. Here, all I want is this Google Click ID. I want to know that this GCLID is going to exist, and when that exists, I want to capture it and store it. So I'm going to write a simple rule based on this Click ID. And I can write click on this and I can select copy property path, which will copy the path to this Google Click ID variable. And I'm going to select automatic variable, and I'm going to search for this property path. You can see URL automatic values .parameters.gclid. If you're not familiar with how the data layer works, visit listenlayer.com, go to use cases, and there's a video at the top of the kind of use cases screen that walks through generally how the data layer works. But this is just a path to this variable. And when this exists with any value, and my event is URL parameters, so you can see this URL parameters is the name of my event that's occurring in the data layer, and my Google Click ID exists with any value. When those things are true, I want to go ahead and set the value of my user GCLID local storage key, which is what I had created up here under browser storage. And I want to put the GCLID here. So I'm going to actually save it in the user's browser. Now to do that, of course I can just write text here. You can do a number of things here, but I'm actually just going to find the Google Click ID, which again is going to be that path that I copied over here from the console. And I'm going to select that. And so I'm basically taking this value out of the data layer and I'm storing it in this local storage key called user GCLID. Now we need to tell ListenLayer how to behave when it stores this piece of information. So if the key has an existing value, I'm going to select to not overwrite the existing value, because my goal is to always keep the original GCLID that somebody comes in on. I don't necessarily want to overwrite that. I also don't necessarily want to chain them together as a comma delimited list. I just want to keep the original value. So this tells ListenLayer how we want that to behave. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. And I do just want to clarify real fast, jumping back into my rule. When I go to conditions and we're looking at this automatic variable called GCLID, and we have this path, and we're looking at the browser storage action here and we have the same path. Again, this is a variable in my data layer that's being automatically generated. So this corresponds back over here to my data layer variables. Going to variable settings. Again, what I have referenced there is this GCLID. And you can actually click on this information bubble and you can see the path to this data layer variable. So this is another place that you can actually copy that path, as well as just getting it from the console. We will have a Google Chrome add-on that will make it a little bit easier to see the data layer activity, interact with it, and get data layer values. Okay, so now we have our browser storage rule set up, and we're going to go ahead and publish our changes. So we're storing our GCLID. Now remember, we chose to use local storage. So I'm going to go over here, and I may actually have some data in my application from testing previously. So bear with me here. I'm going to go ahead and make sure that I don't. It looks like I do not. So that's an important thing, is just to be aware of, if you've been testing on a site before, to get familiar with the application section and clear your old data, which we will talk about here in just a minute. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a hard refresh just to make sure I get the latest version of everything on my site. And again, we can see we have this URL parameters event, and it's parsed out the URL parameters. We have a Google Click ID. And if I were to have multiple URL parameters like UTMs and things, those would all be listed here, and I could also capture those and store them in the browser. So now I have a Google Click ID, and I had this event occur, and what I would expect then is that this Google Click ID was stored in the browser as a result of this rule. And it would have been stored in a local storage key called user_GCLID. So let's go and look and see if it's there. The moment of truth here. And it is. So the application tab, when you're inspecting in your browser, allows you to take a look at local storage, session storage, and cookies. So depending on which storage variable type you have selected, you're going to look under that section inside of application. You're going to select the actual domain you're working with, and then you can see a list of all of the storage keys. Now, let's make sure that it's behaving correctly. What if I come in with a new Google Click ID? I would expect that my original one is going to remain intact, and that did occur. You can see back on my console, I have a new URL parameters event. I have a new Google Click ID, but the version that's been stored in the browser has remained unchanged. So now we've effectively captured our Google Click ID and stored it in the browser so that it will persist. What matters next is to understand when we need to capture this Google Click ID. And most often we're going to want to capture this when a critical activity occurs, such as a chat beginning or a form being submitted. The GCLID allows you to enable offline conversion tracking, but that means you need some sort of data set external to Google Ads that you're then re-importing into Google Ads. And you can literally do this from a Google Sheet using a Zapier integration with Google Ads, for example. Or you can send this data directly into Salesforce when a form is submitted, and you can integrate Salesforce with Google Ads. There's a number of ways that you can do this. But the key thing to remember is that we need to store it in the browser, and then we need to capture it at that critical moment when someone becomes a lead or when something important happens. And so we're going to dive into that next, and we're going to use gravity forms as an example of capturing the GCLID when a critical activity occurs. So here we are back in ListenLayer, and I'm going to enable my gravity forms listener. And remember that we are trying to capture the Google Click ID when a gravity form is submitted. So I need my listener enabled so that I know when a form is submitted. I'm going to jump to form activity, and I'm going to enable the form load feature so I get some data layer activity when a form loads on a page. And I'm going to enable a single form submission or single step form submission. Now, of course, this will work with multi-step submissions, which also includes step changes and some other things, but these are my two main features that I need. So what's going to happen is when a form loads on a page, we're going to actually populate a hidden field in that form with the Google Click ID, and this can be done with ListenLayer alone. And then when the form is submitted, that information obviously will exist in that hidden field, and it will be captured into the gravity form system, or along with the lead, it'll be captured. And so if you're sending that somewhere like Salesforce or something along those lines, the GCLID will be attached to that lead. But what I like to do oftentimes is first push the Google Click ID into the data layer when a form is submitted. And remember, we have these two sections. We have an automatic value section in our data layer activity, and then we'll have this section called custom values. So if I ever want to push something or make something custom in my data layer, I'm going to put it into custom values. And to do this, I'm going to enable the custom data layer values feature. And we'll worry about populating the hidden field as a next step. The reason I like to push the GCLID back into the data layer when the event occurs is because it gives me a visual reference inside my data layer for what actually exists, and I can confirm that things are working. But also it's pretty powerful if you do, for example, need to capture your Click ID in a separate way. Like let's say you're using a chat tool and it's hard, you can't really like populate a hidden field on chat, but you still want to collect this. The way you can do that is you can actually collect it directly out of the data layer. When a chat begins, you might be getting the user's email address because they filled out like a pre-chat form or something along those lines. or they just started a chat and it has a chat ID that gets pushed into the data layer. And you can also push the Google Click ID into the data layer at the same time. Once those are in the data layer at the same time during an event, you can grab those in Google Tag Manager, and you can, for example, use GTM to store them in a Google Sheet. Now, we will eventually have our own integration with Zapier, so you'd be able to take that directly out of the data layer with Zapier, for example, and send it to a Google Sheet or something like that, or to a data set that you have that you can merge up with your offline data based on the chat ID or the user's email. So it can be really powerful sometimes just to use the custom data layer values to get something out of browser storage and put it back into the data layer. So when I enabled this custom data layer values, I get this new custom data layer values rules screen, which allows me to write rules to push custom values into my data layer when certain things happen. But notice here it says I can't write rules until I have a custom variable. So I'm going to jump up to my custom data layer variables. And again, similar to browser storage, these are variables in my data layer that I create globally, and then they become available to do stuff with. So this first one, I'm going to just call it user GCLID. I'm just going to match the name of the browser storage just for simplicity, so I don't introduce a lot of new naming concepts. And now this is available to write rules for. And if I write a rule for it, when some sort of data layer activity occurs, I can have that custom value appear here in the data layer with an actual value. This variable will appear there with a value. And now that I have that, I'm going to jump down to custom values inside of Gravity Forms, and I'm going to say, let's just write a simple rule. You can write some really advanced lookup rules, but I'm just going to write a simple rule. I'm going to get the GCLID into the data layer when a form loads or is submitted. Now, what I really care about is getting it when it's submitted, but I'm going to push it in when the form loads also, just so I can see it more easily. And my condition here is when my Gravity form is loaded, so when that's true, or when my Gravity form is submitted, that's true. Then I'm going to once that condition is met, I'm going to push some value into the data layer, and I'm going to push it into the Google Click ID. And the value that I'm going to push is actually going to come from my browser storage. So remember, we stored our Google Click ID right here in the browser. So this local storage key called user GCLID, I want to get the value from that, and I want to put it back in the data layer. And remember, I did have a cookie version created, but I used the local storage key. So just remember to keep those straight and put those in here. Put the correct one in here. So again, when my condition is met, my form loads or my form is submitted, we're going to push the GCLID back into the data layer. And I'm going to go ahead and publish my changes. So I'm going to push GCLID into data layer. And we'll go ahead and do a hard refresh just to make sure we get all the latest version of everything. And I'm going to go ahead and go to my Gravity Forms page here. So nothing fancy, but we have a couple forms on this page. And you can see we have 2 GF form loaded events. These have been pushed into the data layer. And this is occurring because ListenLayer sees the form on the page. And I have this feature called form loads enabled. And what you'll see is we of course have our automatic values, which includes everything from our form itself, like all the fields, the hidden fields, the visible fields, those things. And we also have a custom value here called user GCLID. This is what I just wrote a rule for. So again, in my custom values here, I have this rule that says, hey, when these data layer activities occur, grab the GCLID value, put it back in my data layer. So I can see it here because the form loads. But of course, what I care about is when the form is actually submitted. So let's just go ahead and submit a form. And you can see my form is submitted. I didn't get no redirects or anything, just got a successful form submission. And this is what you would track your form submissions based on: GF form submitted. And of course, you can push a bunch of custom values in here based on what form is it and which page does it exist on and how is it categorized. But in this case, we just have the Google Click ID. So now that I have this in Google Tag Manager, I can easily create a trigger that says, hey, whenever GF form submitted occurs, let's also get this variable called user click ID. I'm going to register that in Google Tag Manager. And then I can use a tag in GTM to grab that information. So as the form is submitted or when this event occurs, the trigger is fired and the variable can be sent in with a tag. So you could send the GCLID, for example, into analytics platforms or things of that nature. Or like I said, you can actually just send it into a Google Sheet. There's some cool guides online for how to take something from a Google tag and have it send into a Google Sheet. So this is really step one. I can see that successfully as my form is submitted, I have a Google Click ID that's appearing in my data layer. And this Click ID could have been from a user session that happened 3 or 4 days ago, or even a couple weeks ago, because it's persisted in their browser. It's like I said, most Google Click ID setups that I've seen, they assume that the user fills out a form on the exact page that they land on, and the GCLID is taken directly from the URL, and that's that. And it never, that's almost never the case for how people behave on your website. We need to store the GCLID, then we need to get the GCLID out of storage when the user completes a critical action. In this case, though, we only have it in our data layer. We want to also capture it directly with our lead in our form. So we're going to jump into a feature called Populate Fields, and we're going to use that to populate a hidden field next. All right, so I'm looking at the back end of my WordPress website, and we have a handful of different gravity forms here. The ones that we care about are, we're going to use this top one here to test with. So I just want to make sure I know exactly which form is this one. You can see we have 2 forms that are loading on the page. I'm going to go ahead and submit this one just so I can differentiate between that and this form that's further down the page. And I can see that this is G form 2. So there's my form ID. So when I jump back here, let's just go to forms overall. And form ID number 2 is this tracking data layer gravity forms. I'm going to go ahead and edit this. And you can see I already have my hidden field set up. So if you want to capture your GCLID with a form submission, you need a hidden field. There's different ways to set these up on different marketing automation systems and form tools, but generally you gotta get this hidden field in here. And you're going to want to the best of your ability, be able to put a value in on the CSS class of that field. And when we go back to our form and we take a look at this field, you can have a developer, who works on the forms work on this. You can kind of explain it to them, or you can get start to get a little bit more sophisticated with how these work. But if I'm inspecting my form here, I could see that we have these list items, and we have this input here. I think this is the GCLID. What I can do is I can do a search for GCLID. And yes, so this input is the hidden field that corresponds with this GCLID field here. Now, what can be a little bit challenging is how form systems often operate. When you create a field on the form, it'll output it into the code just like this, but it'll output it in different ways. Sometimes it's very obvious, hey, this is the GCLID field. Like you can see this label that says GCLID makes it a little bit obvious. But other times it's not so obvious. You can see here the ID of this field, for example, and the name is just input 6, input 2_2_6. And the challenge with this is if we go to a different form, like let's say we look down at this form, this also could have a GCLID field. And it might be called something completely different. So here's that GCLID field on this other form. And this one is called, let's go to the input here, input 7, input 47. So what's happening here is we have two different forms, and they both have a hidden field called GCLID. But because of how my form system works, one of the fields is ID field ID number 6, and the other one is field ID number 7. You can see that right here, input 7. And again, if I go back up to this one, input 6. So this can be quite challenging, because imagine if you had 10 different forms on your website and you want to capture GCLID on all of them. So you put a hidden field on all 10 forms. There's a good chance that you're going to end up with 10 unique fields that are all completely different. They look different, they have a different ID. And our goal is to write a simple rule that pushes the GCLID into all of those fields. Some form systems like HubSpot make this really easy, because you create a centralized field called GCLID, and no matter what, if you put that on 10 different forms, the field looks the same. And so you can literally just select that field from a dropdown. But in this case, we can't do that, because we can quickly see, hey, I put a hidden field on Gravity Forms. I put it on two different forms, and I can see one of them is input 6, and one of them is the other one called input 7. And that's why just a minute ago, I was mentioning that, you know, it's valuable to be able to put a CSS class on here, because we can then target this field based on this CSS class. So the way that, you know, the CSS class outputs on the field somewhere, you'll get this value. So you can see class equals, and it has a long string, and this is what determines what your field looks like. Well, most form systems have the ability to add a custom value into your class. Sometimes that will be added directly on the input. Sometimes it'll be added on a div tag above it, or a p tag, or a list tag. So you can see here what I've done is I've gone ahead and I put user_GCLID on this field, and it's been output here in my code. And so I just recommend, if you're working with hidden fields, that's kind of step number one. How do I add the hidden field? And then how do I identify the field in my code? And can I put a class name on it so that I can easily identify that field? And then you're going to want to put that same exact class name on another form. So let's go ahead and submit this form so I can find it in the back of my system. I'm going to see what form ID this one is. And we'll see that this form ID is GForm4. Let's go back to our forms. We'll open up GForm4. So here we have our two forms, and we have a hidden field called GCLID on this one. And when I go to advanced or wherever I was at, appearance, sorry. If I go to appearance, I go to user, you can see I've added this custom CSS class called user GCLID. And here we have the same thing. If I go to GCLID and then I expand appearance, I've put the same value here. So just get in the habit of, hey, if I'm going to be trying to populate something into hidden fields, ListenLayer makes it extremely easy, but it still is a little bit advanced. I need to be able to identify my fields. So let's go ahead and just put a common class on all of my GCLID fields across all of my forms. And then it'll be easy to identify. So once you get to that point where you have some hidden fields on a handful of forms, and you've created some sort of unique class, and you've put those onto the hidden fields, then we're going to want to jump back into the ListenLayer and start working with how we can actually populate that hidden field across all those forms with the Google Click ID and do it in a very reliable way. So now we're back in our ListenLayer account, and I've navigated to Gravity Forms, Customization and Storage, and I'm going to enable the Populate Fields feature. And there's a learn video, so if you need to dig into this and have a little bit more practice, go ahead and do this. This is a little bit more of an advanced feature, but ListenLayer simplifies this in an amazing way. what you'll see is we have a new screen here called Populate Fields where we can create rules based on data layer activity that will then push information into hidden fields on our forms. So I'm going to go ahead and create a rule, and I'm going to call it Populate Google Click ID. And what's going to happen here is I want an event in my data layer to occur. I want my forms to load. When you're populating fields, you're almost always going to do it when the form loads. So my condition is going to be very simple. Hey, every time my form loads, go ahead and try to take the Google Click ID from my local storage and put it into a hidden field. Now, I would recommend keeping these rules really simple. The reason is because we will actually loop the rule once it is triggered. So once this rule is triggered, we're going to try to get a value from the browser storage, and we're going to try to put it in the hidden field. And if there is no value in the browser storage, we're going to wait and we're going to run the rule again. And this is helpful because there is a rare instance where during a single kind of data layer event, you're both trying to store something in the browser for persistence and then take it out of the browser and put it back into the data layer and put it back into a hidden field on a form. And so in that case, we want to maximize our kind of data integrity and data quality. And so we want to give our application multiple opportunities to try to populate that field. So this condition is simply just going to trigger, hey, let's look for a GCLID. Let's try to populate this field. So every time a gravity form loads, we're going to trigger this event that's going to look for that GCLID in the browser. And that GCLID, remember, again, is stored in this local storage key. Now, I can just free-form kind of define which local storage key I want to get something from. I don't select from a drop-down list. And that's because this feature allows you to get information from a local storage key that ListenLayer did not create or set. So you could get, for example, the Google Analytics user ID, the ID that's set by Google Analytics. You could grab that. That's stored automatically by Google Analytics in a cookie. So you could grab that and you could store that. And I want to push it into a field. Now, remember, though, we talked just a minute ago about how our GCLID shows up as input 6 on one field, and it shows up as, I think it was input 7 or maybe 4. Let's go back and double check. Yeah, input 7 on this field. So in this field, it's called ID 7. On this field, it's called ID 6. Well, I don't really want to write a rule for every single one of those fields, because let's say I had 10 forms. I would have 10 unique GCLID fields. I would have to write 10 unique kind of rules to populate those GCLID fields. And then every time a new form is added, I'd have to add a GCLID field. It would get a new ID, most likely, and I would have to write a rule to populate that. So you can imagine that is not scalable at all. So rather than selecting from a list of inputs, which, by the way, these lists of inputs are coming from our data layer activity. Remember, ListenLayer sees the forms, we parse the form, we put it into the data layer, and then all of that becomes available to work with inside of the system. So if you're not seeing something inside this list, it's because we haven't seen the gravity forms activity, and you would need to go turn on your data layer features and get some activity by loading forms and submitting a few forms. So rather than selecting from this drop-down list, though, we're just going to choose to use a CSS selector to target those fields. And remember, that's why we put this user GCLID in the class field. We've put that on both of our fields so that we can identify this field across all of them. So I'm going to get this value. And you can watch this video about CSS selectors. And if you continue to, if you're having challenges with this, and shoot us a note and have us help you take a look at it and get your setup to work. But you can watch this video to get a little bit more insight, but I'm going to target the class, not the ID. So I'm going to put a period here and user GCLID. This is the most basic rule that you can write when it comes to CSS selectors. And I'd recommend, if you can just accomplish it this way, just follow these steps. Come up with a unique way of identifying a GCLID field in the class, put it on all your fields, put that on all your forms, and then target it here like this, .user GCLID. I'm going to save this, and I'm going to go ahead and populate. I'm going to publish this, populate fields. And And this should work pretty quickly. I'm gonna go ahead and just do a hard refresh here. And remember, I already have my browser storage value here, 1, 2, 3, 4. And now my forms have loaded on my page. So I should be able to see that my hidden field values are populated. So I'm going to use my data layer activity first to look for this. I'm going to go into my automatic values. I'm going to go to form fields, and I'm going to go, and I'm going to find that input 6. And you can see here immediately we have a value in my field called 1, 2, 3, 4. Now I'm going to go down to this other form, and I'm going to see if it worked there. Automatic values, form field values, input 7, which is my GCLID field here, has a value 1, 2, 3, 4. So while this feels quite complicated, it's actually pretty simple. What we've done is we've just added a hidden field to all of our forms. We've identified that by putting a common CSS class on that. And then we've just jumped into into ListenLayer. We've created a populate fields rule that targets any field that has this user GCLID on it. Now there's a little bit more complexity around this. And lots of different situations where things might be slightly different, but they'll all generally work. And I'll talk about a few of those. But let's first look at this. We're going to drill into the actual code, and you can see my GCLID field actually shows that it's empty here, but my data layer value showed that it's populated. And this can occur sometimes with JavaScript where the hidden field actually shows that it's empty, even though technically it's populated. That's why, you can see here it is populated with a value 1, 2, 3, 4. And if I submit this form, I'll get that GCLID value in the back of Gravity Forms. So just keep in mind there can be some kind of weird situations here where I'm not seeing my value. I'm pretty sure I set everything up correctly. Can you guys double check this? We can give you some commands to run. We can double check things for you and help you get those things set up, because like I said, this is a little bit more of an advanced feature. So again, this field looks like it's empty, but it's actually populated. It's a very, very strange situation. Now, the other thing to kind of point out about this is this user GCLID is way up here on this list element, and our input is way down here inside this div tag. When you identify a field using a CSS selector like this, we're going to try to populate any field that we see inside the HTML element that CSS selector targets. So just keep that in mind. That's another interesting little use case. And watch this video if you're having issues, and submit a support ticket. So we're going to go ahead and submit our form. Again, let's just double check, make sure that we actually have our value coming in on our input number 6. We have 1, 2, 3, 4. And we are going to submit this form, and we'll check it out in the back of WordPress here. It's this one. So let's go to entries. We should get an entry, and look, we can see our GCLID was just populated here. So even though I didn't see it in the code, I saw it in my data layer, in my form load, kind of the parsing of the form and pushing it into the data layer. And then I can see it actually being captured with my lead. So now I have an actual set of lead information here. We would have the user's email and first name and whatever their lead information is. And we would have captured their GCLID. We have our timestamp, so we can feed all of this back into Google Ads. So quite a few different steps here. Just as a recap, we had to first capture our Google Click ID using our URL parameter. And then we stored it in the browser. And we saved it there for use in the future as the user kind of interacts with our website. Then what we did is we used our form listener, or this could be a chat listener, and we pushed it back. We pushed the value of the GCLID back into the data layer so that it's available when that important KPI occurs. We can then grab it out of Google Tag Manager, or out of the data layer using Google Tag Manager, and do something with it. But then lastly, we populated some hidden fields with the GCLID values. And this is the part that can be a little challenging, because you have to go set up your GCLID fields, your hidden fields. You have to kind of commonly identify those with a CSS class. And then you write a simple rule to just populate them, and you can test it. Let us know if you guys have any challenges with this. We're more than willing to jump into your situation and help test it, help get you guys set up, and hope you have a great time capturing your Google Click IDs.